Today I wanted to jump on a video and talk you through the difference between hip rotation and pelvic rotation. So I've been keeping my eyes peeled over the last few years, but definitely in the last few weeks, at how little comprehension people have between what their hip is doing and what their pelvis is doing. And I just wanted to walk you through a little test that you can do very, very quickly that will help illustrate the difference between your hip, the femur, the thigh bone rotating within the kind of hip socket versus your whole pelvis twisting, because so many people have the issues that they have in terms of pain, dysfunction, compensation, etc., because they are not rotating their hips properly in the socket. And then they do these things like yoga or Pilates where they're trying to give themselves this range of movement, but actually they're compensating even more and making the problem worse because they're never understanding or fully addressing the lack of rotation in the hip socket, which is so important. So this is going to be a really quick little test, but I just want to get you thinking perhaps a bit differently than how you have before. And excuse my partial nudity, but it's so that you can see my pelvis shift or not shift as I demonstrate something to you. So as ever, before we get started, if this hurts, which is different than feeling awkward or like something's waking up differently or is stretching, then do not push through this exercise. For some people, you are going to be so just locked up in this area that there's going to be no movement there whatsoever at the moment. So don't force anything that feels wrong, and don't continue through pain because it won't be doing you good. Okay, cool. So we're going to do a little test on the floor. So the reason I'm doing this is I did a yoga class the other day, and this was one of the exercises that we did, but literally nobody rotated their hip, which was the purpose of the class. So I wanted to kind of highlight it now. So we're going to lay prone, and when we're laying prone, I want you to get a sense of how the front of your hips, like the bony bits here, the bony front of the pelvis, the iliac crest, is on the floor. So you don't need to know that it's the iliac crest, just think about your hips. So the very front of your hips are on the floor. And feel how, if I was to like lift my bottom up into the sky like this, you can see my hips are moving away from the floor. When I do that, I have gone from being initially in hip extension, so I'm like stretching my hips out into extension, and then I'm moving into extension of the lower back and actually flexion of my hips. So there's nothing wrong with this, but it's just a different movement, and we need to be mindful of these subtle differences and nuances so that we can start to understand our body and understand the things that it's not doing well. And in my experience with my clients, most people are doing this when they think they are moving their hips. So hopefully that's going to make a bit of sense in a minute. So the exercise that we did in this yoga class the other day was that we got instructed to lift our knee to the side and take it quite high, so like this, okay? So sort of at this like 90-degree angle. And I'm going to do that slowly again because I want you to watch this like lower back portion of my this lower back kind of pelvic portion of my body as I move my leg. They are different entities and they shouldn't have to move together. But tight hips will make your lower back and your pelvis want to go with you. So just don't watch my leg, watch that lower back pelvic portion that I just highlighted. And as I move it, can you see that my bum is lifting off the ground in the way that I demonstrated, and there's like a shift around here. So now if I put my hand like on the front of my hip, the front of my hip is off the floor. Guess what? I might be rotating my hip a little bit, but actually the thing that's moving the most is my pelvis, not my leg. So if I'm laying like this, I might be having a lovely time thinking that I'm opening my hip, but actually all I'm doing is teaching my pelvis to twist and contort rather than teach my hip how to rotate fully on its own. So what do we do to modify this? Well, firstly, if you're my client, there would be 100 exercises that I could give you to teach you what hip rotation actually feels like. But in the context of this exercise, what we're going to do is make sure that we don't bring our knee to the side any further than we can without the pelvis lifting off the floor. So it's going to feel entirely different. It's going to be much, much harder, and it possibly may frustrate you. So if you are somebody who really identifies with being very flexible or very capable of doing things, this can be something that really delivers a bit of a hard truth, and I'm certainly one of those people. I will not be able to get my knee anywhere near this position. My knee, and actually we can do it from here. So let's put our hands on the front of our pelvis, slide our leg down a little bit, and we're sort of pushing down through the front of that pelvis there. Side of the feet is on the floor, and the side of the side of the lower leg is on the floor. And now my hip is actually rotating. So the front of my pelvis is once again grounding on the floor. I haven't gone so high that the pelvis lifts up. And for some of you, and again, all of this is doing is don't take it personally. Take this as a cue that you've learned something new about your body, and understanding and discovering these things help move you forwards rather than keep you trapped in the land of ignorance and denial. So what you may also discover is that to keep your hip on the floor, you're really having to like lift up that lower leg to sort of push the hip down. And that's sort of showing you that the lower leg is trying to compensate for a lack of rotation through that hip as well. So I'm going to show you one more time on the other side, because I did a little test of this beforehand, and you can see the difference between the compensation and the functional movement quite nicely. So here is me moving my left leg as high as I can go to kind of trick myself into thinking that I'm opening up my hip. Watch my pelvis and lower back. Can you see that? Can you see how there's that shift through the lower back and through the butt? That's me rotating my pelvis. My left hip is off the floor. Now my left hip is much less functional than my right hip. My left hip does not move very well at all. So I think on this side, I'm going to have to take my left knee down quite a lot more than I do on my right hand side. And I'm moving that all the way down. So now you can see how my kind of pelvis and lower back is settled, but my foot, and you can see on this side, I cannot get that lower leg to touch the floor in the same way that I can on the right hand side. And this just, it feels nice. I can feel stuff kind of working around my glutes and in my external rotators, but it just feels a bit more awkward and hard. So I'm just going to quickly demonstrate that one last time and then I'll finish the video, but I encourage you to try the same exercise and to see how much rotation, external rotation specifically in this instance, you have in both of your hips, and it may well feel different from side to side. So I'm going to move my leg without thinking about it, letting the ego take over, tricking me into thinking I'm opening up my hip. Watch my bottom and lower back. Okay, that is not my hip rotating, versus trying to push down through my left hip so it stays on the floor, allowing the knee to go where it needs to go. I'm probably going to get a cramp actually, which is a good sign that I'm actually getting some rotation back into the hip. And now you can see how my pelvis and lower back are changing, and I am definitely feeling stuff in my left hip, but I am not able to put the side of my left leg on the floor, just because the hip is not able to open up enough. But I'm just going to let it hang there. And the more that I try doing this type of stuff, and the more that I feel the reaction in the bottom area, the more I know that I'm working on the right bits, and at some point in the future, I will match up more with my right hand side, which is by no means perfect, but I'm able to keep the foot, I'm able to keep the side of my lower leg and my hip on the floor at a much better angle than I can on that left hand side. So there are a million different ways of testing these types of things. This is literally just one example that I'm coming up with because I did it in a yoga class the other day, and as ever, like I do this all the time, I can never switch off. I was looking around and I was like, nobody knows really what rotating their hip feels like versus twisting their pelvis. But if you are always twisting your pelvis and not rotating your hip, you will end up with pain at some point in the future. I promise you. I can't say where it's going to be, but that lack of function in such an important mobile joint will come and bite you in the arse, excuse the pun, at some point in the future. So do make sure that you are tuning into these little subtleties, because they make the world of difference.